There is a moment that recurs in the archives of the early 19th century, a moment that resists simple explanation. It appears not as a declaration or an announcement, but as a hesitation, a pause in language where observers struggled to describe what they had seen. Paintings, letters, municipal reports, and private diaries from around 1812 repeatedly circle the same problem. Destruction that behaved unlike destruction was supposed to behave. One such image hangs in a major European museum. It shows a city in flames, rendered with the calm precision of an academic painter. At first glance, it fits comfortably into the familiar story of invasion and retreat, of torched buildings and military desperation. Yet the longer the image is studied, the less stable it becomes. The light is wrong. It does not flicker or pool. It overwhelms. The fire does not appear to spread from structure to structure. It seems to exist everywhere at once. The buildings do not collapse into themselves. They appear fixed in place, as if arrested at the instant of exposure. This is not a matter of symbolism or artistic license. Comparable paintings from the same period depict fire with consistent visual grammar. Orange and red tongues of flame, black smoke, partial collapse. Here, the palette is washed toward white. The brightness dominates the composition. The city seems less consumed than erased. Official history offers reassurance. The year is 1812. Europe is at war. Armies march, retreat, burn supplies, deny shelter. Cities are lost and rebuilt. The story is tragic, but coherent, and yet, coherence begins to fracture when the scope widens. The same year that Moscow burned, cities across the northern hemisphere recorded fires of unusual scale and intensity. Municipal records describe destruction occurring too quickly to be contained, consuming districts in hours rather than days. Eyewitnesses struggled to explain why stone structures failed so completely, why metal fixtures warped, why entire neighborhoods appeared transformed rather than damaged. These accounts were not written by scientists or strategists. They came from merchants, clergy, doctors, and soldiers. Their language is imprecise but persistent. Light before sound, heat without visible flame. Wind that arrived suddenly and vanished just as abruptly. Fire that did not move but appeared. One diary entry describes covering the eyes as the brightness intensified, only to feel pain through closed lids and cloth. Another notes a sudden silence following an initial flash, a momentary stillness before the arrival of force. Such descriptions recur across regions that, according to political narratives, had no direct connection. This is where doubt enters, not as certainty, but as discomfort. The accepted explanation requires coincidence on a remarkable scale. Independent conflicts, independent fires, independent failures of containment, all occurring within the same narrow window of time. Each is plausible in isolation. Together, they strain credibility. The military narrative compounds the problem. The catastrophic losses of the invading army are traditionally attributed to winter, distance, and attrition. Yet contemporary reports suggest the army was already severely diminished before the cold set in. Units vanished without record of engagement. Supply lines collapsed not because of harassment, but because there was nothing left to supply. Scouts advanced into cities that were intact yet empty, food untouched, possessions abandoned. This phenomenon was noted without explanation and then quietly folded into the larger story. War, after all, produces chaos. Civilians flee. Records are lost. Silence becomes absence rather than evidence. But silence has a shape. The descriptions of abandoned cities suggest preparation rather than panic. Doors locked, goods left behind, infrastructure intact. It resembles evacuation more than flight. The question left unasked is evacuation from what? Archaeology adds another layer of uncertainty. Beneath multiple major cities lies a thin, consistent stratum of ash, dated to the early 19th century. It marks a break in material culture, a moment after which construction methods simplify, ornamentation diminishes, and urban planning resets. Scholars refer to it cautiously as a discontinuity, a neutral term that avoids speculation. Neutrality, however, does not resolve cause. The task of the investigator is not to replace one grand narrative with another, but to notice when narratives fail to account for their own debris. The year 1812 is stable only if examined narrowly. When viewed globally, it begins to tremble. This episode does not propose an answer. It establishes a problem. A year marked by simultaneous destruction, anomalous descriptions, and a quiet erasure that conventional explanations struggle to contain. The archives do not shout. They hesitate. And that hesitation is where the investigation begins. If the fires of 1812 were not merely local consequences of war, then the next question becomes unavoidable. What pattern emerges when those fires are mapped together rather than explained apart? Patterns do not announce themselves. They emerge slowly, through repetition, through anomalies that refuse to cancel each other out. When the fires of 1812 are plotted geographically, the resulting image is unsettling, not because it is chaotic, but because it is oddly uniform. Reports from cities separated by oceans describe destruction that follows similar sequences. A sudden brightness, a delay, an overwhelming force. Afterward, heat intense enough to alter materials thought resistant to fire. Stone discolored beyond surface charring. Metal deformed as if briefly softened. In several locations, glass appears where none should exist. Fused residues, glossy layers embedded in rubble. Ordinary urban fires, even large ones, do not generate such effects. Their temperatures fluctuate, their damage uneven. Here, witnesses describe completeness. Entire districts rendered uninhabitable in moments. In some cases, people survived the initial event, only to fall ill days or weeks later, exhibiting symptoms that physicians of the time could not classify. The medical notes are careful, observational, and deeply unsettled. Hair loss, skin injuries without clear burns, internal bleeding absent obvious trauma, death following apparent recovery. The doctors did not speculate. They documented and moved on, lacking both terminology and framework. It is tempting from a modern vantage point to impose explanations retroactively. That temptation must be resisted. The goal is not to diagnose the past with present certainty, but to recognize when the past recorded phenomena that did not fit its own understanding. Beyond Europe, similar disturbances appear. In the Americas, major cities recorded fires of unknown origin. Official reports often cite accidents, yet offer no mechanism. In some cases, reconstruction required not repair but replacement, as foundations revealed damage inconsistent with surface-level burning. Further south, a catastrophic event destroyed a major city, officially classified as an earthquake. Yet eyewitnesses noted the absence of prolonged shaking. Instead, they described heat rising from the ground, structures deforming rather than toppling, devastation occurring instantaneously rather than in waves. In the Caribbean and parts of Asia, volcanic activity clustered within the same narrow time frame. Eruptions that were historically uncorrelated appeared almost synchronized. Records note confusion more than panic. an inability to understand why distant regions were experiencing parallel catastrophes. At this stage, the investigation risks overreach. Correlation is not causation. History is littered with coincidental alignments, and yet the insistence of the data complicates dismissal. The same year, the same descriptive language, the same material consequences. Architecture offers quieter testimony. Buildings officially dated to before 1812 often bear internal scars, mineral discoloration beneath later renovations, structural alterations inconsistent with gradual decay. In some cities, older foundations reveal workmanship and scale exceeding what was constructed above them in the decades that followed. This suggests not destruction alone, but replacement. A rebuilding that did not restore what was lost, but simplified it. A civilization restarting under constraints it did not previously face. The dominant historical narrative explains this as economic exhaustion. Wars drain resources, skills are lost, ambition contracts. These explanations are not false. They are incomplete. What is missing is a cause proportionate to the effect, something capable of producing simultaneous global disruption, something capable of altering materials, human bodies, and cultural trajectories within a single generation. At this point, some turn to forgotten empires, to civilizations described only obliquely in old maps and inconsistent records. Names appear that modern history treats as exaggerations or misunderstandings, administrative placeholders rather than political realities. The question is not whether such entities existed as imagined, but whether their erasure aligns with the discontinuities observed. The archives resist clarity. They offer fragments. A letter from an engineer noting that the damage observed exceeded any known military capability. An official remark that cities were transformed rather than destroyed. A private observation that rebuilding felt like constructing atop something vast and unreachable. These voices do not agree on cause. They agree on inadequacy, on the failure of existing explanations to satisfy what was seen. As this episode closes, the investigation stands at a threshold. Either the events of 1812 represent an extraordinary convergence of unrelated disasters, or they point toward a coordinated phenomenon that history has not fully integrated. The next step is not to name that phenomenon, but to examine what vanished with it, not just buildings or populations, but memory itself. When civilizations collapse, they do not simply disappear. They leave behind habits, assumptions, and absences. The most enduring evidence of disruption is not physical ruin, but altered continuity, when what comes after no longer remembers how it came before. Following 1812, records show a subtle but pervasive shift. Educational curricula narrow. Architectural ornamentation declines. Engineering projects become more conservative, favoring repetition over experimentation. This is not regression in the crude sense, but contraction, a drawing inward. Libraries were rebuilt with fewer volumes. City plans abandoned ambitious symmetry for pragmatic grids. Technologies once documented become theoretical, then obsolete, then mythologized. The process is gradual, deniable, and therefore effective. Memory does not vanish through destruction alone. It vanishes when replacement narratives are sufficient. When a simpler story explains enough, complexity becomes unnecessary. The events of 1812 were quickly absorbed into familiar frameworks: war, disaster, recovery. Each explanation accounted for part of the damage. Together, they left no remainder that demanded investigation. The anomalies became footnotes. The footnotes were forgotten. This is not evidence of conspiracy. It is evidence of institutional behavior. History prefers continuity. When faced with rupture, it smooths. The question that lingers is existential rather than technical. If the world experienced a coordinated catastrophe beyond its conceptual capacity, Would it recognize it as such? Or would it reinterpret it until it fit existing language? Some researchers point to older texts describing weapons or forces of immense power, often dismissed as allegory. Others note archaeological sites where stone appears vitrified, where radiation levels deviate from expected baselines, where timelines overlap inconveniently. Each piece is contested, none are definitive. What matters is not whether a single explanation prevails, but whether inquiry is permitted to persist. The year 1812 may represent many things simultaneously: war, disaster, transition. It may also represent something unacknowledged, a reset whose mechanisms remain obscured by the success of the story that replaced it. Quietly, beneath rebuilt streets and revised textbooks, the material record continues to exist. Scars embedded in stone, ash beneath foundations. Descriptions written by people who lacked the words for what they witnessed. History does not lie in the dramatic sense. It simplifies, and simplification, over time, becomes indistinguishable from truth. The investigation does not end with certainty. It ends with recognition that the past may be less stable than we assume, and that civilization itself may be more fragile, more recursive than linear narratives allow. If there was an ending in 1812, it did not announce itself as such. It folded into continuity, leaving behind a world that functioned, remembered selectively, and moved on. And if that is the case, then the most unsettling possibility is not what happened then, but how easily it was forgotten. What survives catastrophe is rarely the thing that mattered most. Tools survive, walls survive, fragments of infrastructure survive, meaning does not. By the early decades after 1812, the world appeared functional again. Trade resumed, governments stabilized, new capitals were planned. On the surface, continuity prevailed, but beneath that surface, something fundamental had shifted. Not violently, but quietly, as if the underlying assumptions of civilization had been revised without announcement. The records from this period show an unusual tension between confidence and uncertainty. Engineers wrote with authority while admitting confusion. Architects followed inherited forms they no longer fully understood. Administrators governed cities whose original purposes had become obscure. The language of mastery remained, but its substance had thinned. Consider the rebuilding process itself. In multiple cities, reconstruction did not restore what had been lost. It simplified. Massive foundations were reused without replication of their scale. Decorative systems were abandoned in favor of minimal facades. Entire construction techniques vanished from manuals, not because they were forbidden, but because no one could reliably reproduce them. This is often explained as pragmatism. After devastation, societies rebuild quickly, not beautifully. Yet speed alone does not account for the disappearance of knowledge. Even in wartime, crafts persist. Apprentices train, manuals circulate. Here the loss appears generational and immediate. At the same time, new historical narratives hardened. The chaos of the early 19th century was reorganized into discrete conflicts, each with its own causes and conclusions. The War of 1812, the Napoleonic Wars, regional disasters, natural calamities. Each was documented, categorized, and closed. What these narratives share is isolation. They explain events locally, never globally. They discourage comparison across continents. They do not ask why destruction clustered temporally, why material damage followed similar patterns, or why recovery coincided with simplification everywhere. The absence of such questions is not accidental. Institutions stabilize by narrowing scope. When continuity is threatened, explanation becomes conservative. Complexity is reframed as coincidence. Discontinuity is softened into transition. Memory, in this sense, becomes selective not through malice, but through necessity. Personal accounts from the decades following 1812 reveal another layer, a subtle unease among those tasked with rebuilding. Letters describe a sense of inheriting ruins without context, of living amid structures that felt misaligned with contemporary capability, of restoring cities that seemed older than their recorded histories. These remarks never coalesced into theory. They remained private discomforts. Over time, they faded as new generations accepted the rebuilt world as given. What was lost was not merely an empire or a technology, but a reference point. Without that reference, the present redefined itself as origin. The idea that civilization could end and restart within historical time became unthinkable. This episode of the investigation does not argue that a single hidden power orchestrated erasure. It suggests something subtler, that the scale of disruption exceeded the interpretive capacity of those who survived it. Faced with evidence they could not contextualize, they simplified reality until it became livable. If this is true, then the most enduring legacy of 1812 is not destruction, but amnesia, structured, reinforced, and eventually internalized. The question that follows is not what technology was used or who wielded it. It is how identity survives when its past becomes inaccessible. Identity is built from continuity. When continuity breaks, identity recalibrates. After 1812, nations emerged that defined themselves less by inherited memory and more by administrative order. Borders hardened, census-taking intensified, standardization accelerated. Education systems emphasized recent history while compressing earlier eras into abstraction. This was not a conspiracy. It was a response. In a world that had experienced profound rupture, predictability became paramount. Systems that reduced ambiguity flourished. Systems that preserved deep memory did not. Urban populations expanded into rebuilt cities without awareness of what lay beneath them. The past became architectural rather than lived, a matter of facades and dates rather than experience. Foundations turned into curiosities, anomalies into trivia. At the personal level, this shift manifested as dislocation. Diaries from the mid-19th century increasingly express a sense of living after something unnamed, a feeling that the world had settled into a smaller version of itself. Ambition remained, but scale diminished. Even language reflects this contraction. Descriptions of light, heat, and force that appear in early accounts fade from usage, not because the phenomena ceased to exist, but because the frame to describe them was no longer relevant. Without repetition, words lose necessity. By the time industrialization reshaped the world later in the century, the rupture of 1812 had been fully absorbed. New technologies created the illusion of linear progress. The idea that advanced systems could have existed earlier became implausible, then absurd. This is how historical boundaries solidify, not through proof, but through familiarity. The investigation reaches its final stage here, not with revelation, but with recognition. The possibility that modern civilization is not the first to reach complexity is less destabilizing than it seems. What is destabilizing is how easily such a possibility can vanish from collective awareness. If a global catastrophe occurred within recorded history and left only ambiguous traces, then the reliability of historical memory itself must be reconsidered, not rejected, but understood as contingent, shaped by survival rather than truth. The events of 1812 may never yield definitive answers. Evidence degrades, records contradict, interpretation remains contested, but the pattern remains. Simultaneous destruction, material anomalies, cultural discontinuity, and rapid normalization. Civilization did not end, it adjusted, and perhaps that is the most unsettling conclusion. Not that something terrible happened, but that it happened, was survived, and then quietly folded into a story that required no further questions. History, in this view, is not a record of what occurred. It is a record of what could be remembered without destabilizing the present. The investigation closes not with certainty, but with an open recognition that beneath the surface of the modern world lies a quieter past, marked not by monuments, but by absence. And absence, once accepted, is the hardest thing to recover from.